Through the Noise Insights with Ernesto Glucksmann and Mickey Panayotakis.
My name's Michael Gibbs. I am principal and founder of Global Insights in Professional Security. It's a startup that helps assert thought leadership for young security companies, creates content strategy and actual content, and looks for business opportunities for them. Before that, I worked for 25 years for ASIS International, which is the premier association for security professionals around the world. And I had a lot of roles there. I started as an editor of their magazine, Security Management, for which I wrote about 1,000 articles over the years. I developed their CSO Center for Leadership and Development, which is a separate organization for the most senior professionals in Fortune 1000 companies. And I eventually became responsible for all content that they created. So from the magazine to learning to certification, standards, guidelines, and other information. And so for the past year, I've been with my own firm, and I just started a podcast called Security Insights, the podcast. So very clean and simple. Mickey, please introduce yourself.
I am Mickey Panayotakis. I am a partner and also kind of the tech lead for Through the Noise Consulting. We consult organizations on technical and, of course, security aspects. And I also frequently co-host the Through the Noise podcast. You guys may know me from the Through the Noise Insights sections that I kind of geek out on. And great to be here with Mike to talk about security stuff.
So what are you seeing? I'll tell you what I'm seeing right now. We're in the midst of this COVID pandemic. We're in the midst of an economic crisis. We're in the midst of social upheaval, political echo chambers. We have we've got fires raging across the country. We have tornadoes and double hurricanes and all sorts of things tormenting our country. 2020 hopefully is a year for the record books, never to be seen again, though. I don't know if I'm comfortable making that prediction because things seem, to be sliding down a little bit. But so the security impacts of all those factors are enormous. We're seeing traditional security give way to more safety considerations. It used to be that safety was kind of a compliance or regulatory afterthought. I mean, obviously, it's extremely important for life safety, evacuation and things like that. But you wouldn't dream in the old days of propping a door open in an R&D laboratory or in a factory. But now that's the default state because you are much less worried about someone committing espionage or thieving a laptop than you are about getting your staff back in, feeling comfortable, not having to touch doors, not confined with a closed door with a lack of airflow. So we see those things. We've seen staying with access control, more of a trend towards touchless and frictionless solutions, facial recognition, touchless fingerprint systems, which do exist, turning away from the kind of old key cards, especially since a lot of people touch them and they get recycled. And then you have really basic issues like, okay, you have touchless access control, you use your face, the lock releases, but how are you going to open the door handle? So, you have all sorts of options for that. Some companies are distributing this key-like devices, antimicrobial, some sort of metal that you can hook into the door and pull it over. You can push elevator buttons. Others are just putting hand sanitizer on either side of the door. Others might have foot pedals to open the door or two-way doors that you can see through. So there's all sorts of follow-on effects of COVID just on access control. And then you get into other areas like insider threat. And all of a sudden you have people working at home who have never really worked at home for long periods of time. And companies that never had to supply this much hardware and administer network operations from 100 different sites rather than just from their office. And now we're seeing people who are using their computers at home. It might not be properly configured. It might not be updated. It might not be patched. And they're sharing their computers with their family. And kids are coming in and they may be seeing sensitive documents that their parents have up. And there's the insider threat emerges from there because you have people who fear for their jobs, all of a sudden don't feel like they're being watched. So maybe they have access and they can sell some of the information they have, or more likely inadvertently something slips out because the same controls aren't in place and something gets forwarded to somebody by mistake. And believe me, when something gets forwarded to someone else by mistake, it always gets into the wrong hands. That's sort of a law of nature. So let me pause there and let you tell me what you see and comment on those thoughts.
No, I think I see the same thing. I'm glad you kind of started with that. All these kind of environmental and biological disasters that are happening because, from kind of the walled garden of where we sit here in DC and in the work that we do, especially on the technical side, we always think about like how do we protect physical assets, how do we protect employees and both digital as well as physical assets, but we don't think about the overall security, about how do we actually interact that and what does that mean. I remember I used to run a large number of data centers way back when, and every one of them had a mantra. Before you go in, you had to like go through the first door, then get identified, then go through the second door, and there's all this like security thing. And right now we're kind of, I think there's a lot of fatigue in some ways. We're kind of say, well, why exactly do we need all that? Can we just get rid of it? And as you said, open the doors and let the air in, let everything shine. And I think the kind of the pendulum is swinging, because the reason we have all the security things in place is to prevent bad things from happening. If you don't have them, tomorrow the world is going to end. But over time, something bad will happen. The law of nature is that eventually, if you leave your door open, someone's going to walk in, right? So I think from my perspective, I'm seeing a lot of, as you said, video communications, online communications, meetings, and there is an openness both in using computers and sharing accounts. And there's expected to be a lot of openness, but at the same time that there is some worry there that private assets that should be kept secure will no longer have these controls. And it could be a malicious act. It could be a dishonest act, but more than likely there's going to be some sort of accident that happens, that somehow a document or some private information gets leaked out by mistake. So I think one of the things that maybe we can talk a little bit about in a few minutes here is what are the risks associated with this whole, let's call it, I hate to call it the open door policy because, that's a positive thing, but, what are the risks associated with that? What can go wrong and what has gone wrong?
Absolutely. And I was going to say something like mark my words, but anytime anyone tries to predict the future, it goes horribly wrong. So I will say that I predict that when we come out of this and get back to a sort of state of normalcy, and I don't think, a lot of people say this is the new normal. I don't think this is the new normal. I think it's the new abnormal, but we will go back to something that bear some semblance to what life was like before. We'll do more online. We may have less commuting, but air travel will begin again. We'll be going back to restaurants. We'll be having face-to-face meetings and we'll have conferences face-to-face because there's nothing that substitutes for that human connection. But I think that when we come out of this, we're going to see a avalanche of insider crimes, where especially fraud. You're already seeing that Paycheck Protection Program of I think it's the Small Business Association of the U.S. government, is getting its pocket picked. You constantly hear about big companies that shouldn't have received loans, and often these loans are not going to be paid back. And then I was just reading the other day about how smaller companies are taking these, or the principals of smaller companies are taking some of these loans and buying cars and boats and houses, and which is the definition of fraud. But you're also going to see, with the fewer controls, people spread out, people in fear for their job, because let's face it, a lot of people are getting furloughed. A lot of jobs won't come back. They're going to say, hey, I put in my time for this company. Here's an opportunity. I'm getting mine, Jack. And, they need to put in a sort of a fictitious vendor or something for a payment. Maybe they'll do that. And I also think that after this, when the auditors start looking through the books, they're going to find a lot of stuff that began before the pandemic. And now that, no one was taking a close look, but now that everybody is sort of away and you can't really control things as well anymore on the network, it may be that they'll finally get a peek into some fraud that was pre-existing, and they're going to have to deal with that. So that's just one issue, and I'll leave it to you to comment or to rebut or to augment.
Yeah, I think there's so many things here. I mean, yes, certainly. I think, of course, the more you look, the more you find, and I think you're going to find a lot of more looking, therefore a lot more finding. I like what you said about the new normal. I hate that phrase, right? Because what is normal, right? Normal is situational, but dealing with what we have, whether it's the COVID-19 risk, whether it's the fires in California, whether it's the twin hurricanes down in Louisiana, Texas, what we're really talking about is risk, identifying what the risk is and managing it. And I think the same thing with security. What is our risk? What is the risk that something will happen? What are the implications if we don't take these steps to protect ourselves? And I think we see it on the public scale writ large. And what we're seeing is this basically using this pandemic and all these emergencies, all these extremes as an excuse to basically commit fraud or game the system. We see oligarchs using it to try and stay in power longer. We see governments using it, hopefully not as much here in the United States, but we see governments overseas use it to impose anti-free speech measures and really give contracts out to more personal friends and companies that supported them. And, there's a word for that. It's called corruption. It's called graft. Mm-hmm. And people who are prone to it are using this, this moment as an excuse to commit graft in the name of doing it as an emergency. And that is a big risk. On a corporate security side, on an organizational security side, that can happen on a smaller scale. So we do need to identify what those risks are and what the security and the implications for the company's operation. I mean, I guess the reason I am into security is not because, I woke up one day or I was born, back in 1974 for those watching, and said, hey, I want to stop people from doing things in the name of security. The reason we're doing it kind of grew from me out of an interest in an organizational continuity, business mm-hmm. continuity, and security and managing those risks is a part of it. So what we see here is the more challenging the situation, the more at risk people feel for their own personal well-being and monetary well-being, the more likely they are to kind of take certain liberties, let's just say. I don't want to just say everybody's going to commit fraud, but they say, well, perhaps this document or this thing that we put together, it's my intellectual property. That's a fairly normal feeling for someone to have that works for a company, when in fact, it wasn't necessarily you who developed it. It was you in conjunction with 4 or 5 other engineers in your organization, and that intellectual property belongs primarily to your organization because they're the ones who paid for it, and that's what your employment contract says. So, there's definitely a intentional risk or risk of intentional misuse and fraud. There's also accidental or impropriety that's not necessarily malicious in nature, but it's still fraudulent legally and does harm to the company's operational structure.
Yeah, you made a lot of really good points there. I'm not sure which one to address first, though you started with talking about graft and corruption. And I had made a point on the other side of the coin that with everybody rushing, they won't be, they're dishing out laptops and other equipment that's not properly configured. People don't know how to use. There's no training. They don't do good cyber hygiene. But you rightly pointed out that they're also rushing to get contract work, to get things done, to pivot to different suppliers. So there's not as many people watching, and that breeds corruption, especially when you say, we don't have time to scout around for different contracts. I know this guy. I trust this guy. He's going to get a no-bid contract. And oops, that no-bid contract comes with a kickback. And I'm sure all this stuff is happening because it's happened in previous crises. And it's just the way it goes. And we really have to be wary of that. But yeah, business has to get done too. You wait a day or two and you forfeit your chance to contract for a specific part that's in short supply and you're out of business, or you've got to pay a higher price, and that puts you at a disadvantage compared to your competitors. So yeah, that's a great point. And as well, you brought up the insider threat that isn't necessarily malign, but more negligent. It's like, well, I'm at home now. No one's watching me do this. I don't really need, it's like, well, clean desk policy. Why do I need that? Or, why do I need to log out all the time? It's like, well, it's, the access. Yes, obviously you still have, adversaries still have internet access, but you have people walking into your house and people looking at your screen. And, I have a business partner who, he's been subject. He has a small business. He has 20 people working for him, and he deals in information. And he's had people placed in his organization to steal. And he's also had people who just said, oh, look at this stuff that I worked on today. And they showed it to somebody, and the person took a screenshot. And the next thing you know, the stuff was on the internet being sold. It was valuable information. So there's all sorts of stuff out there. I think you made some very strong points.
Yeah, this happened. I'll give you a perfect example. I got an email yesterday. My business partner, you mentioned business partners, he emailed me his son's immunization records because he hit my email address instead of his school's, right? I know him, he knows me, we trust each other. That's not really a big deal, but that's a very innocent mistake. And it could tomorrow, it may be your employees emailing, their poker group with your company's private and important and expensive intellectual property by mistake because they just sent it to the wrong address. So I think that happens. I also think, graft and corruption, there's certainly a lot of it that is intentional, but there's also a lot of it that kind of happens in a continuum. You don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to rip everybody off. But what does happen, this is a great example that you brought up, I love it, is you try to get a contract and you don't have part A of the 7-part series that you need. Your competitor may or may not have it, but they say they do. So you have to say you do as well in order to compete in this environment. It's kind of like the whole doping scandal with pretty much
Lance
any
Armstrong.
sport.
Yeah,
Lance Armstrong. Yeah, I was going to bring him up, but I decided to. But that's a great example. Everybody in the sport is doing it. Everybody in the sport was doing it, and you couldn't compete without it. So you don't just wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to just dope all of my teammates, but eventually that becomes standard, and it takes a scapegoat, and it takes a lot of effort to kind of break out of that. I mean, we had the whole cycling sport. I bike a little bit. Had a big scandal, a big doping issue for many years before I even found out about it. And the same thing that happens with graft. It goes over time, and it sort of becomes a situation where every day or every week it gets a little bit more complex, a little bit more difficult to do business without kind of exaggerating your capabilities. And a year later, you are not lying about what you have. And you're like, well, I can just say I have this vaccine, and if you give me $5 billion now, I'll deliver it to you next week. And that just becomes the standard of doing business. And it's not okay, but hopefully there are, going back to security and what we're here for, there are protocols in place, or there should be protocols in place to kind of catch that early on and be aware that this is where this leads.
To your point about the immunization records, I fear, and I already see, a tremendous number of problems with HIPAA violations, totally unintentional, but there's so much medical information being passed around. I'll give you an example. You made me think with the immunization records of your partner's daughter. My daughter is a college student. 3 days in, she actually attends a college. They're doing a hybrid of in-person and online. 3 days in, she had to be quarantined because she had dinner with someone who later tested positive. So they put her in quarantine. And while she was there, a nurse came in and said, here, and she handed my daughter some medicine and left. And my daughter looked at it and said, that's funny, I don't take any medicine. She looked, it was medicine for somebody else. So now she knew the person who took a specific type of medicine, and can infer now what medical issues she had. And God forbid, see, my daughter's not stupid. She wouldn't take the medication, but the liability if my daughter had actually taken the medicine and thought it was, didn't look at the package and she really needed medicine. So there's 360 degrees of risk here, and I'm sure, and this is not to put down the nurse, I'm sure they're being overworked. There's incredible amount of pressure to manage students at a university. People are coming in and out, and you're trying to contact trace people who are going to defy the rules. So even with the most dedicated and thoughtful people and, trying to be on the up and up, things like that happen, like somebody clicks a button and sends immunization records. And in my case, you got the 360 degrees of risk.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we're continually seeing here is that it's a quote unquote emergency. And the first thing that goes out the window in an emergency is compliance. And whether that's HIPAA compliance, GDPR compliance, those are things that we deal with a lot, as well as, IT security compliance, things like, as you said, logging out of your laptop, logging out of your systems, having a separate secure laptop. And of course, there's compliance all up and down the chain, and they just go out the window. So I think, we're kind of reaching around the 20, 25-minute mark here. So I think what I'd like to think about kind of in closing, and I'll give it back to you to sum up, is that I think it's more important, even though it's easier to avoid compliance and say, well, in this new normal, and we excuse everything, this whole new normal idea. And that's why I hate that phrase, is because you can just get away with murder saying, well, it's the new normal, right? So I think it's even more important now to actually say, well, no, it's the new normal. And that doesn't mean that we have to throw compliance out the window. That means that we have to reinforce the need for compliance, because the compliance is not there to make our lives difficult. It's there to protect ourselves and to make sure that we do things in a secure and safe way, and make sure that our rights, both individually and our corporate continuity, our business continuity, is maintained, and our rights are maintained. So yeah, the thing I would like to kind of reinforce here in my closing is that just the need to be more vigilant about compliance and about following the protocols that are put in place.
Yeah, no, that's very important. And it just so happens that I've been interviewing a lot of chief security officers on new duties and responsibilities they've taken on from COVID, and other things they've had to let fall by the wayside because they don't have the resources, the manpower, the budget. And what's fallen by the wayside in some cases is compliance issues, not necessarily GDPR, things like that, but site surveys and things that, in specific statutes or regulations or best practices or guidelines or certifications where you're supposed to maintain it, you're supposed to do a number of site surveys, or you're supposed to do risk analyses, blah, blah, blah. They're saying, you know what? And I'm going to get back to your point about risk. This is all about risk. And you have to look at it in a triage situation. What is your biggest risk? What's the risk reward ratio? You're not going to put all your attention into something that is a minor risk in the scheme of things. Yet you also don't want to run afoul of the law. But I'm seeing that a lot of organizations are saying, well, we're all hands on deck on COVID. We're going to leave some of these compliance things to the side because everyone's leaving it to the side. The advanced companies I've seen, the people who are dealing with this, and they all have limitations, the best are people who say, okay, you 10 people or 7 people or 5 people are dealing COVID-related things only. The other 3, 4, 5, you're making sure that everything else runs, that we're compliant with other things, that training is happening, that the regular block and tackle of security is getting done. It's extremely difficult, but it has to be addressed.
I totally agree. And I think that's a good way of doing it, and saying that we have a team that deals with all those new things, but we also have a team that maintains kind of a semblance of what needs to happen regardless of this kind of AKA emergency, or people say emergency. So I think it's good enough for one episode. So I appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Mickey.
We'll talk again, I guess, hopefully soon. There's so much stuff to cover, so I enjoy talking with you.
Yeah, this was great. Very, very mind-bending, very illuminating. Yeah, thanks, Mickey.
And of course, thanks everyone for listening as well. And talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
For more episodes of Through the Noise, go to throughthenoise.us.